Waiting for Lauren to get back. Well, I know Lauren Hertzer is walking down the stairs, so I'm going to go ahead and start. My name is Blair Rubel, and I'm director of the Comparative Urban Studies Project here at the Wilson Center, and I'm actually chairing another event momentarily, so I'm going to leave you in the hands of our colleagues from UNU in a moment. I want to welcome you to this event on behalf of the Wilson Center and our colleagues from UNU, and Dr. Jean-Marc Quacot will be chairing and moderating the session, and he is the director of the Office of UNU in New York. This has really been what we hope will be the first step of collaboration between the Wilson Center and UNU on in a number of areas. Before I turn the floor over, I have a couple of announcements. The first is please turn off all personal electronic communications equipment. It interferes with the sound system, so all Blackberries, pagers, cell phones, etc. We'd appreciate it if you could turn them off. I want to thank Lauren Hertzer and our colleague Allison Garland. Cell phone, that's what happens here. From CUSP here at the Wilson Center for organizing this event, as well as Peter Marcotullio and Anna Crisp from UNU. There are biographies of all the speakers that are available outside. I hope you have them. I don't think either Jean-Marc or I want to spend time reading them, but they do make for interesting reading, so I hope you get the bio sheet. Finally, I just want to mention that our next event with the Comparative Urban Studies program will be Wednesday, February 4th from 9 to 11, and there's information outside about it, entitled Climate Prosperity and Democratic Capitalism with a Twist. And it will feature a number of speakers who have been working on these issues in collaboration with the Global Urban Development and Collaborative Economics Project. So you can read more information about that as well. But I think having made our way through the bureaucratic announcements, it's a nice small audience. It will be a good opportunity to have a conversation. I'll turn it over to Jean-Marc to get you started.
Thank you, Blair, and welcome here this afternoon. As Blair mentioned, I am Jean-Marc Quacot, the director of the United Nations University Office at the UN in Europe. This is in fact the second year that the Wilson Center and NYU and the United Nations University work together on organizing something in programs in Washington. But this is the first time that we work together with the Kennan Institute, and it's a pleasure, and we hope that it's going to be not the last time. Before I give the floor to Peter and Robert, let me say a few words about the United Nations University. The UNU is a think tank for the UN. We are headquartered in Tokyo. In fact, we are the only UN organization headquartered in Asia. Initially, we were mainly based essentially based in Japan. Over the years, we grew into an organization which is worldwide now, with 14 centers, research and training centers located around the world, in Asia, including Japan, China, and Malaysia, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Europe, and in the Americas. In the Americas, we have 3 centers, one in Canada, one in the US, with Cornell University, and one in Venezuela, in Southern America. We focus basically on 3 types of issues: international security, international environment, and international development. In these areas, we do applied research, policy research, always in partnership with other universities, other think tanks, the private sector, governments, and NGOs. And Peter, who is at the moment distinguished lecturer with CUNY in New York, is also one of our senior research scientists in the field of urban studies in Yokohama with the Institute of Advanced Studies. So I think that Peter will share with us this afternoon some of his, some of the findings of his research in the field of urban studies, and then Robert McDonald, who is a Vanguard Scientist at the Nature Conservancy here in DC, will talk about the work of the ideas put forward by Peter. So, Peter.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks all who came out in the cold. And thanks to John Mark and Anna Crisp for their patience in putting this together, and of course Blair Rubel and Lauren, as well as Robert, who very much last minute was able to change his schedule and come down. It was really, really nice for him to be here and moderate. Let me give you a little background about myself. I was with the UNU full-time for about 10 or 11 years, and 9 of those years were in Japan, in what was called the urban program at the time at the UNU-IAS, Institute of Advanced Studies. And when I first arrived there, our focus was on globalization and urban development, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. And coming from a place like New York and then moving directly to Asia, I was astounded at the activity level, and this was 1997. So it was even before like the massive growth that we see now started to occur in China. At the growth what was happening in these urban centers, they were essentially exploding. And what we tried to do at that time was to relate some of this development in physical forms to the economic changes and as well as the social flows that were moving into and out of these cities. Subsequent to that, I became very interested in examining the urban environments in these places. And because of the UNU, because of my position at the UNU as well as my interest in development, we started to look at urban environmental history, if you will, starting to ask questions such as how do urban environments change with quote-unquote development? And after a number of different examinations sort of scattered here and there, I was able to put together a narrative. And what I'm going to talk about today is sort of the outlines of that narrative. And I want to look at this as a sort of a set of claims and put forth before you for your comment and criticism. The title probably could use some work, is Urban Socio-Ecological Systems and Environmental Transitions in the Asia-Pacific Region. And the way I'll proceed is in the talk is to begin with the concept of urban environmental transition that has been promoted or developed and promoted by Gordon McGranahan of the IIED. And then from that, I will add, if you will, 2 different lenses from which we can see further into the development process. And one of them is a comparison of historical experiences, Asia-Pacific cities and those of the quote-unquote North or the West, if you will, and also to add this issue of socio-ecological systems. And here I was very influenced by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the concept of ecosystem services. The second part of the presentation will be looking at some data in terms of comparing these transitions, and the third part I'm going to try and draw some conclusions. All right, so let's start with some concepts and some theories. I'm not sure you are know about this urban environmental transition theory, so I'll just present it quickly. We start off with the question, what's the relationship between wealth and environmental conditions in cities? Essentially, the way that Gordon answered this was that environmental conditions shift in type and scale of impact, both geographic and temporal, with increasing wealth. So they use wealth or income on the x-axis, and they look at changes in the relationships between sets of environmental issues and wealth. This was schematically presented in an early document, the 1992 World Bank Report on Development and the Environment. And there you could see three, let's say, different functional relationships between types of environmental conditions in cities and wealth. In the top two boxes, what you're seeing are what they call traditional or local conditions, things like access to water supply and access to sanitation, and in this case, non-access. They drop dramatically as wealth increases. The middle boxes are reminiscent of what might be called the environmental Kuznets curve, where things get worse and they get better. These are what they call the gray agenda issues, things like air quality and water quality, that continually get worse with increasing wealth, and then at some tipping point, turn around and get better. And then finally, we have another set of issues which seemingly continue to rise with increasing wealth. In this case, things like consumption and emission levels, like carbon emissions per capita. Now, the tool, what the environmental transition theory did was they put these three curves together, suggesting that there were shifts in, as I mentioned, let's say the geographic scale of impact with increasing wealth. The temporal impact shifted also from immediate health-related concerns to long-term delayed ecosystem returns, concerns. And it was certainly a major advance over the notion of the environmental Kuznets curve, because it did include these issues of scale, which so often are ignored. Now, some of the problems, or the let's say limitations of the theory, is the way I see it, is that it does not distinguish between differences in historical experiences. So it suggests that all cities, no matter when they were developing, sort of go through this process of shifting from one transition to the next. And it draws attention to shifts in types of burdens. So for example, it starts off with health issues like access to water supply and sanitation, then moves to sort of environmental quality issues and pollution, things like air, as I mentioned, air pollution, water pollution, and then finally to ecosystem-related issues like CO2 emissions. And we don't really see within this notion or within this lens, for example, what happens to ecosystem-related notions at the local scale while we develop. So what I'm attempting to do is to put a little more into this theory by adding sort of a comparative historical analysis, as well as putting in some information or examples of changes in ecological conditions with development. All right, so how do we differentiate historical experiences? Well, the way I have been looking at this is that globalization, as I mentioned, I come from this sort of background, has had what you might call time-space effects. What are time-space effects? Is that over, let's say, the last 100 years, and specifically over the last 50 years, we've seen this incredible speeding up of activities, including different types of different timings, as well as the increased efficiency of human activities. At the same time, we're also seeing increasingly uneven concentration of phenomena in smaller spaces, like, for example, cities. Arguably, cities are becoming more complex and more diverse over time. So if you think about this, in one way, cities are becoming spatially more similar, or they're converging in some aspects. But temporally, they're becoming more divergent in that they're much different from cities of the past. Now, these time-space effects have had impacts on environmental conditions. And what I argue is that there are three specific impacts that begin to get at some of the differences that we see in Asia-Pacific cities versus what we have seen, for example, in New York, in Washington, and London. The first one is that some environmental conditions and some environmental challenges are appearing lower down on the income ladder. That is, they're appearing sooner in the, if you will, the economic development process. And that these changes are occurring, or the changes between transitions and the changes within the trends of environmental issues are occurring faster over time, comparatively, to that experience of the quote-unquote North. And that rather than a sequential set of transitions, we're seeing increasingly a simultaneous experience, where, for example, a city will have high percentage of populations that don't have access to fresh water and sanitation. At the same time, they have traffic problems and high motorization rates. And at the same time, they're located on the coast, and now they're worried about things like climate change and climate variability, sea level rise, etc. Now, because of these changes, we're seeing dramatic changes in the transitions between these sets. So, if you will, the three curves, as I mentioned, previously the first would be the more traditional brown agenda issues that decrease with income, then the gray agenda issues that follow the Kuznets curve if in a crude way, and then finally the green agenda issues, which ecosystem issues which can seemingly increase geometrically, might have played out something like this in the developed world, where you have one set of issues or challenges responding to solutions, and then which create another set of challenges, i.e., the sanitation systems in the U.S. cities, according to people like Joel Tarr and Martin Melosi, all were developed after water supply systems, because we brought the water in and then we figured out we had to get it out again. The solutions to transportation problems and health issues, such as the emissions from horses, were things like automobiles, which at the time we thought didn't have emissions. And so in this way, we could see why we might have had a sequential pattern of these challenges. What we're finding in the Asia-Pacific is these, or rapidly developing Asia, would be that these are much more crunched together, if you will. I call them telescoped, so that it's becoming increasingly difficult to see any transition from one to the other. Okay. Now, let's add these socio-ecological conditions. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'm just taking this as very simply in a systems viewpoint, looking at the interaction between, let's say, the social system, the social, economic, political system with the biophysical system. The argument is that because it's a system, one affects the other. And in order to understand them, you have to look at these linkages. There's a large, increasing number of global efforts that have used this socio-ecological system analysis. As I mentioned, the Millennium Ecosystem is one of them. They use the concept of ecosystem services, basically defined as those things that ecosystems provide us that increase our, or that are necessary for and increase our human well-being, be they spiritual, be they the provisional goods that we usually think about, the food, the fiber, etc. So if we start to think about those kind of things and add them to this notion of urban environmental transitions, we don't see the ecological changes following the dynamics outlined. So, for example, soil conditions within cities, in some aspects, continue to deteriorate. They don't get better or worse. And what I'll show you is some samples of, where I did a review of soil conditions in cities around the world, and what we find increasingly is that, well, soil contaminants accumulate. They don't go away unless you actively try and mediate that. And this particular problem is not on the agenda. So some things, like soil conditions, continue to deteriorate in time. Also, hydrologic conditions continue to need increasing management from the social system, whether it's channelization, et cetera. But other ecological trends seem to differentiate. For example, biodiversity largely, but not always, responds negatively if you look at it at an urban scale with increasing land use change, habitat fragmentation, et cetera. Sometimes, or in many cases, will cause biodiversity loss. But again, not always, because we also get these invasives, and sometimes that evens out, particularly when we look at plant biodiversity. And with development, the biodiversity, I guess, if you will, stock actually shifts. So, for example, when New York was first being developed, all the trees were cut down. It lost basically almost all of its biodiversity, which then grew back. And even in the last few years, the biodiversity, in terms of even the large mammals, have been changing. We've seen the return of some white-tailed deer, of beaver, of even coyote has come back into the city, certainly raccoon, etc. And also some types of birds. Now, let's add these together and do the comparison, the historical comparison, and I'll just right now show you some quick notes and some quick data that arguably help to support these 5 claims. Again, the first one is that the speed of socio-ecological change is more rapid than previously experienced, that these changes are being experienced more or sooner in the development process or in the economic development process than in the past, and that previously experienced sequential patterns are now increasingly seen in a simultaneous fashion, or in other words, you're seeing less transition. That some local ecological impacts are greater now than experienced in the past. At the same time, some global ecological impacts are actually less intense per capita than in the past. So let me just show you some of these trends. In terms of the rapidity, you could look at national economic growth rates, which are now much faster than experienced by, let's say, Europe or the US, the speed of urbanization, or the change in share over time of the rural and the urban population is increasing much faster than in the past. Urban growth rates, in general, are faster. The big story is Shenzhen, that grew from 300,000 to several million in the course of a few decades. And in terms of, let's say, some sort of environmental issues, the growth in energy supply is much faster now than in the past. And I'll show you some data on that. And here's what I did. I took a series of these nations, and I looked at the change in total primary energy supply. That's the TPES. And I compared those changes over similar ranges of income with that of the U.S. Now, The reason why I picked the U.S. is because the U.S. is aberrant in terms of its energy use. We're much higher than per capita than those of European countries. So I thought if it worked for the U.S., it would work for European countries. And here what I demonstrate is that over similar levels of economic income, what you're finding is much faster rates of change. For example, South Korea, we're finding 124 kilograms oil equivalent change per capita per year, as opposed to when the U.S. was undergoing development at that same income range, it was less than half of that at 43, or probably a third of that, excuse me. Now, the second set of changes are the sooner, and here everyone has probably a sense of this. Technologies are certainly diffusing at lower levels of income. You walk into almost any developing world city in Pacific Asia, and people are walking around with cell phones, and they have really high levels of technology, which the U.S. didn't have at similar levels, obviously because they weren't there in the first place. We see major development patterns such as urbanization occurring at lower levels. So at lower levels of income, you have more people or a greater share of people in cities. And you have things like ecological degradation such as transportation CO2 emissions occurring at lower levels, as well as diet changes at lower levels of income. And for the last two, I'll show you some data. This darker curve is that of the U.S. In terms of transportation CO2 emissions. The bottom here is about 4,500, what's it called, Geary Cameras dollars, which are international dollars of PPP, which is around 1904, say. And then you could see rapid rises in terms of our carbon emissions related to road transportation. But what's happening in most developing world countries is that these carbon emissions are happening much lower. And here's income versus average daily consumption of calories. This here is the U.S. curve. And what we see is that almost a monotonic increase with increasing income. And what we're seeing in Asia is rapid rises over and above, and certainly much sooner than what was experienced in the U.S. In terms of the sequentialness of the patterns and the timing of these patterns, I think that anyone that has been to a developing country, particularly in the Pacific Asia, can see that there are many cities in a particular city, meaning that you can see the pre-industrial city, you can see the industrial city, you can see the post-industrial city, all combined. And this tries to get to that. So, for example, if you did a survey like I did of urban water-related environmental concerns in Southeast Asia, and map those against income, here is the income, the low income, middle income, upper middle, and high income cities, and here's the local, metro-wide, and regional and global issues, rather than something like this where you wouldn't find these sets of problems in these cities. You find all of these problems in almost all cities, except for high-income cities. We don't find low rates of access to water and access to sanitation. For example, Singapore has almost 100% access. BSB also, these kind of things. So the argument here is that, it's very difficult to see any transition, particularly within these sets of problems. Now, finally, or not finally, this is the penultimate claim is that the changes in the local impacts are more ecologically damaging than previously experienced. For example, again, if you look at contamination in soils, or if you look at consumption levels in terms of building materials, you find some interesting things. What I did is I took, as I mentioned, I did a survey of contamination in soils in cities. We looked at things like lead, zinc, copper, cadmium, chromium, and cobalt, and then took averages for those, and these are all European cities. Did the same thing in Asia-Pacific cities, and you find that in some cases the averages are the same or even higher. And these are obviously at much lower levels of income. So the soils in these particular cities are at least contaminated and maybe possibly worse. And finally, what I did here is I looked at buildings and how cities were growing vertically in developed versus developing countries. Here, this is the number of cities we looked at. There's 41 cities in the developed world and 31 in the Asia Pacific. And we looked at the total number of buildings that are 12 stories or more. And what you find is that in terms of the average number of tall buildings per city, there were more in the Asia Pacific. There was only, let's say, 600 in the developed world on average of buildings greater than 12 stories. But in the Asia Pacific, there was 720. And in terms of the total average points per building or the actual size of it, the average size of these buildings is taller. So not only are there more taller buildings, but the buildings themselves are taller. So what we're seeing in the Asia Pacific is a new type of city that's developing, a vertical city. Although in many cases there are working off the model of Manhattan, they're actually surpassing it. And this obviously relates to consumption, the consumption of steel, the consumption of glass, the consumption of concrete, etc. Okay. And finally, the changes, or some of the changes, what we see, particularly in terms of energy, are seemingly less intensive per capita. But I also want to not miss the point that in terms of absolute value, they might be greater because of the larger number of people there. For example, if you look at total CO2 emissions per capita, this is the U.S. curve, okay, and this is GDP, and these are countries and nations in the Asia Pacific. Outside of Singapore, which is flirting with values of the U.S., most of them are way under. So they're actually growing in a more efficient manner in terms of energy consumption and emissions. However, as I mentioned, this has to be tempered with the fact that there's a large number of people, and they will be increasingly moving into the middle class. For example, the World Bank suggests that there'll be 1.2 billion people by 2030 in the middle class just in developing countries, and that, for example, in China and India alone, the prediction is that these middle class individuals will want to share in all the things that we share, including automobiles. So within those two countries alone, they will double the global number of automobiles, and that, as well as other things such as the consumption of meat and all of those impacts. Right. So, in conclusions, what does all this mean? Well, basically, in terms of the implications for the urban environmental transition theory, I think it's a very powerful tool. I think it has to be modified to include these socio-ecological linkages, as well as the differences in experiences, at least among other limitations, which are pointed out by McGranahan and his colleagues. I think that the urban environmental transition theory is better at describing the historical experience of the now developed world than it is currently in explaining what's going on, for example, in places like rapidly developing Pacific Asia. Certainly, local ecological conditions do not seem to follow the patterns laid out in the theory, and this is probably due to the fact that in some cases the behaviors, or let's say the social aspect of the social realm, is responding to technologies that are allowing for increasing or decreasing intensity in terms of impact. Now, within the Asia-Pacific cities, the argument obviously would be that not only are environmental health issues of importance, but also the ecological issues at the local level are of importance and need more attention. these local issues, whether it's biodiversity of soil, are important because not only do they have local impacts, but they can add to global impacts. And that the changes in the socio-ecological conditions require us to think differently about responses. For example, one of the responses that people always advocate in the U.S. As a sustainable solution to cities is putting people more tightly together, compact city or something like this. Now we have to think more carefully about that when we apply it to places in rapidly developing Asia. I mean, we have to also remember that the economic structures in these cities are very different from ours. We have already dispersed our industries while they have been the recipients of these industries. If you tend to compact them, that will potentially increase exposure to health issues. These shifts may result in the threat of unresolved challenges. So what I mean by this is that if we're not careful, what we might see in some of these cities is that the lingering of local brown issues, for example, while other issues become higher up on the agenda, like climate change. So because they're happening simultaneously, and there's always limited resources, one of the threats would be that as the cities develop, they take longer or perhaps never fully resolve some of these issues. On the other hand, there's opportunity here. In fact, what we're seeing is that in many cases, arguably, because of these conditions, there are solutions that are being proposed that are actually much more integrated than that have come from the North or the West, whatever you want to call it, the developed world. For example, bus rapid transit system, congestion pricing, microfinancing, Tetra Pak recycling, and to some extent, urban agriculture are being much more, actually are coming from developed world cities, or actually were first developed there as a way to, arguably, to respond to some of these challenges, or the formation of some of these challenges. And now these policies, in many cases, are being advocated in the developed world. So we're seeing at least two of those tensions, or those tensions being drawn out in two different ways. And finally, whether the developing world's urban socio-ecological systems will become more resilient in the face of further ecological degradation, increased potential for surprise and abrupt changes, will depend on a number of complex interactions. And arguably, these interactions are not yet the focus of research. Okay, that's where I'd like to end it. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Robert, over to you.
Okay. Well, I was asked to be the commenter for this panel, and it's interesting for me. I'm an ecologist, and we don't usually comment after talks, so I had no idea what to do when they first told me to do this. But I'll say a few words about Peter's talk in particular, and then discuss what I see as the science and policy implications. And I'll keep that short, and then hopefully we'll get a discussion going in this room. One of my first responses is, which he raised indirectly, is how useful this focus on GDP and development really is for some of these urban environmental transitions. In a way, it came out of environmental Kuznets curves and that kind of thinking. And I suppose as a scientist, I'm worried about trying to see every environmental transition in that way. A specific example might be ozone and ozone-depleting chemicals. If you think back to some of the concerns about CFCs in the 80s, you might have envisioned at that point that developing economies would just start producing CFCs like the US and Europe were at the time, and you would have a huge catastrophe in terms of the ozone layer. That didn't happen in large part because there was a UN treaty and there was a whole body of scientific work. So in that particular environmental transition, there's no transition that's comparable between the experience of the US and Europe in terms of emitting CFCs and the experience in the developing world. And so maybe we want to talk about two poles, right? One is, Mark Twain had a famous quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it usually rhymes. And so you could imagine this scenario where the way cities develop in Southeast Asia or the subcontinent or West Africa does have some historical similarities and analogies that are worth talking about with the U.S. or European experience. The other pole would be Henry Ford's famous saying, history is bunk. Like, the experience of London or New York means nothing for these cities. So I don't know where we are. I think we're somewhere between those two poles. We can learn some lessons from the urban environmental transition, but we probably can't do everything. He mentioned biodiversity. I work for the Nature Conservancy, and I'm a landscape ecologist. And one important thing to keep in mind there is that biodiversity is different than species richness per se. So he talked about this finding in urban areas, which has been shown a lot, that often total species richness, the number of species within cities, goes up as they develop. People tend to bring in more species, usually generalist species, sort of weedy species, if you want to call them that, and typically rare or endemic species, native species, would be lost. So at a global extent, you see a decline in species richness, but at a local extent, you might see an increase. And ecologists would usually talk about biodiversity in that global sense, not that local sense. He mentioned this issue that ecologists are now talking a lot about ecosystem services, and the folks in the urban planning and geography world who think about the urban environmental transition are using environmental burdens as a phrase. And I think those two are related. They're kind of the flip of each other, right? So Peter, when we talk, we'll often talk about air pollution getting better, and ecologists now will talk about the supply of clean air increasing. And they're sort of flip sides, but it makes it difficult for our disciplines to talk sometimes. What do I see as some science implications here? Surprisingly, there's little true global quantitative data for how the biosphere, if you want to call it that, is getting more unstable or more vulnerable, the extent to which that's happening. It's very difficult to do the kind of comparative analysis he's doing, particularly for a large set of cities. The Millennium Assessment still is the best source for a lot of it, but really they had one chapter on cities, which Peter worked on. We are now working to start what we're calling a global look at urbanization and the environment, so drawing together a set of researchers internationally to collect global data on how cities are affecting the environment. If you want to put it in a pragmatic sense, what does it mean that there's going to be 2 billion new urban residents in cities? What does that mean for ecosystem services? Both the supply and demand of ecosystem services, if you want to put it that way. And we're definitely in that endeavor trying to be global rather than a case study approach. Most of the literature on urban environmental interactions is about almost all the papers are about one or two cities. So it's hard to draw some general lessons from that. My own research is about urbanization and biodiversity and what that impact is. And you can think about two types of impact. One is a direct impact, the spatial footprint of cities getting bigger. And that's significant. Cities occupy maybe, depending on how you measure them, 2 to 4% of the Earth's land surface. And my own research suggests that it affects about 8% of species. So 8% of the imperiled species on the IUCN Red List are there because of urbanization in one form or another. There's also these indirect effects, which are potentially much, much larger. This idea that the drive for consumption by humans, and we're now primarily an urban species, that drive for consumption is affecting almost every facet of the environment on Earth in some fashion or the other. And those linkages are very complex. And so one of the things ecologists are struggling with is how we deal with this in a sophisticated way. So not a Club of Rome, limits to growth, simple way, but in a more mature way that thinks about technology change. And that's one of the reasons I find this urban environmental transmission theory very useful and interesting. There's still one other big scientific question out there, and Peter and I talk about this sometimes when we're just hanging out. Ecologists like to think, well, is this urbanization thing good or bad for the environment? We could reduce it to one answer. And maybe that's naive, but people do talk about that sometimes. Most of the urbanization is also associated with a migration from rural areas to urban areas. And that migration also relieves ecological pressure on rural areas often. So there's a benefit there for conservationists like myself. But there are also all these unique challenges in the urban sphere that urban growth causes. So I'll say just a couple policy implications, and then we can talk. One that I have in seeing this talk is, how can we speed the transitions, right? So that's something my company, the Nature Conservancy, would be interested in. If they are happening faster and sooner in Southeast Asia, the transition to clean drinking water, or the transition to slowing down air pollution, that's great. But what is needed to speed them up even more? Is it just a technology transfer issue? Is it more than that, and it's a capital issue and a lack of capital to invest in those infrastructures? You could probably come up with a whole set of things. But that broader question of, how do you foster a more sustainable urban form and speed up those transitions, I think, is a big question. And it's particularly complicated in most capitalist economies because the urban form is usually not the result of one or two planning decisions, but of thousands and thousands of decisions of individual actors, developers and mayors and engineers. One other idea I've played around with is, in my head, is could you experiment with one city? If somebody said to me, oh, okay, Rob, here's $500 million, go make this city in India as sustainable as possible, I'm not quite sure I would know what to do. So first of all, it's frustrating as a scientist that we don't have all those answers. But second, it would be cool to do that experiment in the way that people who do health in the developing world and people who do straight-up development in the developing world are trying to do that, this idea of outcome-based projects. And I don't think we think about urban sustainability that way. So anyway, those are some thoughts. And now this is the part where I throw it out to you, and you guys respond to anything I said or anything Peter said.
Thank you, Robert. So if you could give your name and the organization to which you belong, and then... A microphone, yes.
Yeah, Qiao Chen, freelance correspondent. Yeah, the meeting really generate more question than answer. Yeah, I just particular point some. The first most important is in the first speak talk about the conclusion, modification of urban planning. I think it's very urgent that we should try to get what do you know about the urban development and put some that what the element in there should be modified, and then get to the people in Asian or to people in North American or in any other place, and they look at their situation and do their own thing according the item list there, because I think this is the best way to for the people they come in to learn the experience that people have before and do the change accordingly, change and plan accordingly. And also that the second speech he talked about this sustainability, and because after I heard the first speech, I was thinking about this United Nations University, this urban development should have some kind of cooperation with UN so-called Sustainable Development Program. I think this is very important. Also that you see, actual human activity is contribute to the environmental or the ecological degradation. So I think this, when we talk about consumption, we also need to talk about what their contribution to the ecology and environment degradation. And then we do the things in the line of the sustainable development. And also, I look at the thing that the urban agriculture. I have been trying to say this. Now, we always talk about this urban development, but we never talk about the rural development. I think these two things should go hand to hand together. If you have urban without rural, you can have a sustainable development. And these two have to be complementary to each other. Thank you.
Yeah. Do you want to speak to this, how the rural-urban linkage and how that fits into your talk some?
Well, it's a great point, and I completely agree that what we need to do is to somehow link the policies in cities with activities in rural areas. I didn't talk about the urban-rural linkages that much in this talk, but I completely agree with the comment that is a very, very crucial issue. Would you like to?
No, I would just agree that I think that linkage is very important. And maybe as a tangent to this, but I think it's interesting. It's interesting to see how the relationship between cities and rural environments changes as countries develop as well. That there's been this historical tendency when countries are poor for farmers to be taxed fairly heavily, and some of that to be used to feed urban populations or ensure urban populations have sufficient food. And as countries develop, but by the time you get to the level that the US or Europe is at, and certainly with Japan, there's a tendency for urban dwellers to, in effect, subsidize rural dwellers, and that relationship flips. So there's an interesting pattern there, and it's clearly policy-driven, but it's interesting that lots of countries have independently made that policy choice. So, anyone else have a comment or question?
Hi, Stephen Dahl from Oxford University. I'm curious, it's very asymmetrical. These cities, they seem to get all the bad things and a lot faster. Why aren't they getting the good things? Is there some general reasons that they don't get high-tech agricultural systems and good transit systems and all these kind of upside possibilities?
Well, that's okay. I guess it's a really good point to bring out, and I think part of it was misrepresentation on my part. I think that, for example, like bus rapid transit came from a developing world city. It was from Curitiba. Tetra Pak, which is those the juice boxes that we all have, the ability to recycle them also came from solution in developing countries, and congestion pricing came from Singapore, etc. So there's actually a lot of solutions, quote unquote good things, that are not coming from the north going to the south, that are actually coming from the south and going to the north. So that's one thing that I probably should have highlighted more. Now, and there's other things that are certainly going down there. Or the reverse way, things like I mentioned, cell phones and PCs and these kind of things, which you find increasingly penetrating at very deep levels, very rapidly in ASEAN cities, for example. I did have a slide that looked at income and PC penetration, and it was the curves were exactly similar, but they were sort of marching down the income scale, if you will. So yeah, these things are also happening. I think the flip side to this, or if I can flip your question a little bit, is anything happening slower in terms of policy? And that's an interesting question. Are we seeing the implementation of policies in a slower manner, particularly social welfare policies and these kind of things, or not? I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's a very, very interesting question. I would say that what we do find in terms of environmental policies, is that increasingly, particularly in the Asia Pacific, there are a lot of environmental policies put into place lower down on the scale. And that has had positive effect. For one example is that, while there are this threat of more cars in China, China has much more stringent cafe regulations than we have. In other words, their cars are much more efficient. They go longer on a gallon of gas than ours do. So the picture's really much more complicated than I laid out.
And I would just add to that I think by talking about environmental issues in urban regions, you end up, unfortunately, talking about a lot of problems. And I don't think that means that either of us is anti-urban, or Peter could sit up here and give a lecture about all of the positive reasons cities form, right? And a lot of economists, Jane Jacobs and the rest of them, have talked about the very powerful economic reasons people cluster into cities, and that dynamic is still clearly true. So there's lots and lots of good reasons, and you could talk about health gains, income gains from people moving to cities, educational gains. So since we're talking about environment, it came off sounding perhaps a bit negative, but there are huge gains in those other spheres because of this big urbanization movement.
That's a great point. I mean, we were actually talking about this before. There's something called the urban the urban mortality penalty.
Okay. Or the urban death trap.
The urban death trap, and I'm sure
this is from the classic period of British urbanization in the 19th century.
Well, it's very interesting. Basically, it is the life years you forego by living in cities. So at a period of time in quote-unquote Western history, if you lived in a city, you lived a shorter life, probably much more brutal life, than you would if you lived in rural areas. Now, the U.S., interestingly, went through that transition where people started to live longer in cities than in rural areas in about 1939. Right, so it took all that time for us to do that. Now, if you go into almost any developing world city, that penalty has been erased.
In fact, it's flipped. On average, life expectancy is greater in cities than in rural areas of developing countries, and that's arguably primarily a function of the greater income there.
And health services, et cetera, and technology, all these things. Yeah. So it's a really complex situation, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Seong-Gyu from the Millennium Project, World Federation of UN Association. And it seems that, first, thank you for your nice, great speech and the recommendation and the presentation. And it seems that you assess you assess that speeding up of urbanization is quite affirmative in environmental approaches, and I agree with that in some point of view. But on the other hand, especially in Asia Pacific area, I mean, there is huge discontinuity between among the development procedure. Especially, there is kind of a discontinuity between the tradition, and also there is a lack of social integration, and also there is a kind of a huge corruption among the development procedure. So it also contains a lot of negative effect in it. So I just want to know whether your research is consider those kind of social and policy issues and transparency issues in your research. I just want to ask that question.
That's a good question. And can do you want to comment about the Thai case? Is interesting, right? That was the one outlier in your
about
slower urban?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will say this, and this relates to the last question too. What I was trying to do is to outline patterns, not so much to value them, if you will, but to outline some of the things that I see that are happening that, vis-a-vis what happened in the West are different. Sort of a way to grasp and understand these cities. Now, speed of urbanization, very interesting question. There are people that argue, for example, that the way to end poverty is to get everybody in cities, or increasingly move people to cities, because cities will generate wealth and alleviate poverty. There's some interesting work being done at the World Bank in this regard. That's that's going to be a debate, and I think it's an interesting debate. We could also talk about health and how health, since the mortality penalty has been erased, people moving to cities actually increasing health, increasing longevity, etc. So there are these positive, if you will, aspects to rapid urbanization, or to urbanization in general. Right. So I think I'll leave it there. I have not looked at governance issues, transparency, corruption, these other things, but certainly they play a role in why these transitions have changed. I have argued that if we look at some of the institutions and the institutional sort of development in the Asia-Pacific, that helps to shed light on why they occurred. But I have not looked specifically at transparency and these kind of things. Maybe Robert.
No, I haven't either, but it's a great question. And there certainly are policy differences among national governments that change a lot of things. Probably the best researched issue there is just the rate of urbanization and also the growth of sort of capital cities and how national policies affected that. And it varies by country, but some countries have really pushed urbanization and particularly the growth of one big capital, and other countries have not, and they've kept a fair number of people in rural areas. China might be a famous example of having a relatively high population in rural areas still. Thailand a bit is in that case as well, I believe.
And I mean, the policies play out in terms of helping some of these transitions. For example, what I've seen in Vietnam is that they have put a lot of energy into urban development, but they have not modernized the agricultural sector. So you can, be in the middle of Hanoi and have all the modern conveniences at your disposal, and then just walk a few kilometers outside the city, and they're using an ox with a wooden plow. It's 5,000-year-old technology in the rice paddy. So obviously, not the modernization of the policies to let's say, I don't want to say biased cities, but let's say against the modernizing the agricultural sector have played out in terms of some of these transitions that we're seeing.
Okay. Does that sort of answer the question?
Just a little bit. I think it's just a little different that I asked you. I mean, my background is... thank you. My background and my research is how to integrate, how to develop a certain city, redevelop a city with a more socially integrated way. So to do that, surely technological support is very important. But on the other hand, the what is that? A kind of policy making and community participation, something like that. It is very important. And I think that when I look at the title of today's conference, I think that it's more integrated way with the social issues and ecological issue. But I think that your speech is more like a combination with ecology issues and capitalism issue and development issue. Is it my where is that comprehension is correct? Do you think so?
Well, I mean, maybe we'll just take that as a comment. I think in defense a bit of Peter, in my field in ecology, anytime you mention people, you feel free to say socio-ecology. So it's a very surface view of what a sociologist or an anthropologist or historian would take. And I think you're seeing the interface of a couple disciplines here. But I think your general point is good, that there's probably more to be explored on either the political or the social dimensions. So
You may say they are interdependent.
Right. I think I would agree with the general notion that a deliberative democracy, if you will, or public participation will lead to better decisions. And obviously impact the transitions. Now, the way they impact better decisions, meaning decisions that are more agreed upon by that society. Or now I don't know how that will essentially affect the, environmental transitions, because all the society is going to have to make trade-offs in terms of deciding where they want to put emphasis and where they're going to prioritize. But certainly those, arguably, when people deliberate and feel that they're empowered through political processes, then they are more, arguably, they're more comfortable with the outcomes. I have not dealt in that area, which would be, I would say, more towards political science, sociology, that kind of area.
well, and this gets back a bit to this idea of GDP or development is sort of the main explanatory axis, because it's a proxy for a lot of processes. And in most countries, as countries get more developed, there's also a whole growth of civil society and other sets of democratic rights and governmental processes, and that you could also argue are playing even a bigger role in causing those transitions. So clearly the GDP is a proxy for a bunch of stuff. And it's not just money. It's also political process.
I mean, in defense of using GDP on the x-axis, basically what I think it does, if you parameterize all of these changes with one variable, what you start to see is the extraordinary complexity of these transitions. And that is not to say that we want to regress the y on x, or to say that it's only about economic change that creates all these environmental change, but rather just to say, okay, let's just hold this variable constant and look at all of these other things, and then when you start to map them out, it demonstrates how different things are in the Asia Pacific than they are in, for example, New York, London, and Paris. That said, some of the other things we're talking about here might be factors in explaining those differences, which I didn't necessarily address here.
Okay. Another question or comment?
So if you look at these cities then, and if you break them down by income, the cities themselves, if you look at the wealthiest areas in developed countries, in developed cities versus the wealthiest areas in developing cities, and for parameters that can be highly localized, like water quality, soil quality, do you see those same patterns, or is it kind of what you would expect where wealthier people are more similar across as opposed to poorer people?
That's a great question. You're asking about intra-urban differentials comparatively. So what we'd like to do is to see how sort of the wealthy class in low-income cities compares to the wealthy class in higher-income cities. Now, this brings up at least, well, first of all, I haven't done that, but I think it's a very interesting project. It also brings up the issue of what is wealthy, what is a affluent city, and what is a poor city, because cities are very diverse, and they include everything, wealth and poverty. So it's, these are crude estimations and caricatures, if you will, of these places. And I think what we need more is exactly what you pointed out, is to look more deeply at the differences within cities and across cities, with that comparative lens, which is something I tried to get at in my last slide.
And I would just add that there's parallel discussions going on, I think, in health circles and also just development circles, because, so I talked about, for instance, this general trend that people live longer in cities, but you can actually, if you go to the poorest neighborhoods in cities, they'll often have shorter life expectancies than the rural areas on average. So there's huge, huge variability, and I think, from my perspective as a scientist, often the problem is just data. So in the developed world, we get very used to high-quality census data and sort of spoiled from it. And in many developing countries, that doesn't exist. Middle-income countries, you can often find it.
Right, but that's a really interesting sort of notion, and I think things like those type of studies I think would add a lot to our understanding of what's going on out there in the developing world.
Is anyone who hasn't said something want to? Okay.
First of all, thank you all for being here. Peter, you might have touched upon this in your presentation. I might have just missed it, but the socio-ecological systems theory, how can it answer some of the policy implications that Robert talked about? Or do you see any way it could influence policy in that regard?
Okay.
We were just talking about this over lunch.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's hard. It's hard. No, we didn't figure it out, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think Robert's policy issues were just...
Well, kind of the overarching one is, what would you do to speed up that transition? Right. What are the set of policy levers that would help make sure that, as much as possible, they're quick? To put it another way, I think us in the conservation community or the environmental community would love it if history was bunk, that the development of the new world cities of the 21st century didn't have to make all of the same mistakes that European and American cities made.
Right. Well, in some ways, we're seeing that they are leapfrogging, particularly in the use of certain technologies, but those technologies are leading to further concerns. So, for example, in terms of the building, the fact that cities can now, build vertically much faster, obviously has impacts in terms of the consumption of the materials you need to build those things. And yes, it's great that people have much higher caloric intake at lower levels of income, but some nutritional experts are suggesting that obesity is becoming a problem, quote unquote, prematurely in developing countries where people are overeating. They're moving from the more, there's also an epidemiological transition. They're moving from the more traditional infectious diseases to the more chronic diseases in a much shorter period of time. So, yeah, we want, in a certain way, we want to speed up some transitions and we want to slow down others. It's just, or certainly change others. It's something that we have to think very carefully about. Now, I think your question was, how does this lens, the socio-ecological lens, help to shed light on that? Right. Well, as Robert mentioned, and as anybody from the social sciences would agree with, is that we don't talk to each other enough. And that you'll get ecologists that don't want to talk about social issues and don't want to talk about cities. And then you'll get social scientists that aren't interested that much in looking at some of the details of ecological change. And I think this lens forces people into a multidisciplinary approach where they need to, because through this lens, the decisions in one sphere affect those in another. And that's how it's all set up. That's how the methodology and the framework is set up, so that we are forced to, the ecologists are forced to, on one hand, consider how humans play a central role in these changes, and vice versa, how our activities impact, for example, soil conditions, which I doubt you'll find many social scientists very interested in looking at. But I think if we do that, and I think increasingly people are, that we might be able to tease out some of the relationships, and then which will obviously lead to policy levers for change.
Yeah. And I would as maybe a tangent, but I would add to that within the environmental community where I'm at now, there's a lot of discussion about policies and what policies other countries should use. But actually, from another perspective, policies are one of the easiest things to foist on another country. If you look at the history of the environmental movement, the idea of creating national parks or having clean water, or whatever, that transfers pretty quick. And technology, the existence or availability of technology often transfers pretty quick. But big capital investments are simply hard, and they take a lot of money, and they take a lot of time. And so one of the implications of very rapid global urban growth now is the amount of capital investment those cities need for mass transit and basic water and sewage is much higher, and you have to put it in much faster than was ever the case in Western European or U.S. cities. And it poses a big challenge. I mean, there's some interesting studies where people try to calculate what are the dollar needs for mass transit infrastructure in Southeast Asia. And I forget the exact figure, but for the cities involved, it's a really big sum. You know, for New York City to struggle to build the subway on 3rd Avenue or whatever is one thing, because even for them it's difficult. But for a city with much lower income, those kinds of investment in mass transit just often aren't feasible. So there is this question too of how do you create some of that infrastructure on the cheap to deal with the fact that the city is growing so quick.
I mean, can I just add on? I mean, the socio-ecological sort of perspective also includes this issue of scale, which is often left out again in both of these disciplines. And what that does, and something that we were talking about again before this, Robert and I were discussing before this meeting, was that it allows you to help identify important trade-offs, if you will, between, let's say, cleaning up a local environment and what that does to other environments. So essentially in the past, what we have done is, as Joel Tarr has mentioned, is to continually search out for the ultimate sink. So as we developed, let's say New York or Pittsburgh or London, what we have done is we just dispersed our problems to larger and larger geographic scales. Because we never considered, the social aspect never considered, or the social sphere really didn't consider what it was doing to the ecological sphere. It just, out of sight, out of mind. And even when I was in graduate school, in geography, one of the mantras that I was given was that the solution to pollution is dilution. And that essentially was just disperse it. Build taller smokestacks. Get the junk into the ocean. It was that kind of thinking, that sort of one-dimensional thinking that got us into, I believe, or helped to get us into the position that we're in now. And what we need to do is to take a step back and say, wow, just because our city is beautiful and it's clean and everybody has fresh water and bathrooms, etc., doesn't mean we're not impacting the environment. And having significant impact in the environment, it's just occurring elsewhere. And to see that elsewhere, this socio-ecological lens is very, very helpful, I believe.
Good. Okay, anyone? Sure.
Yeah, Cha-Chen again, just have some comment from the couple question and answer. First thing is this: I think we should realize urbanization also produces poverty and the slum. And second is this: the World Bank report will be misleading, and also is lack of data, because wealth did not mean it's good, because we got to think about the wealth, negative complication of wealth. For example, okay, the people here eat too much, get obesity. And you got to think about the health consequences of those generated from obesity. So I think overall effect is negative. And also, people talk about speed of the urbanization. I really don't know what is need to be speed up. I think everything have to do is normal speed. Chinese have saying say 欲速则不达. What it means is if you speed up anything you're doing, you never reach your goal. Thank you.
Well, I think they're very provocative points. I think what I heard you say was that urbanization increases poverty.
No, I didn't say increase. I said
Produces poverty, right? Right, and produces slums. I think that's. I would argue with that. I think that arguably, and I could be wrong. You know, we could have a long discussion about this. Is that the reductions in poverty that we're seeing globally are because of urbanization. That urbanization creates wealth. That and that there are.
That's fine, but what I'm talking about is internal inequality.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. So that's a polarization as opposed to right. Oh, yeah. Here, I think you're right in terms of what I think the trend is that we're seeing more polarization, certainly more diversity, if you will, and perhaps at greater lengths. The poles are increasing, in distance. That is a trend. And that could be due to urbanization, or it could be due to what another colleague mentioned had to do with governance.
Yeah, I didn't mean urbanization is bad.
Right.
I just think we need to think about some problem in the urbanization process.
Right. Urbanization is so tied up with other developmental aspects, including increasing wealth or changes in industrial structure, et cetera, that it's hard to say urbanization does this in and of itself. It's hard to tease all that out. I think what you're pointing out is some trends that we definitely have to look at. And what I've sort of would argue is that in the environmental area, certainly to answer Robert's question, cities are better. Because the alternative would be spreading people out evenly or ruralizing them. And that, in certain ways, the impact would be greater. Certainly the regional and global impact of similar activities would be probably greater. So if you had, certain levels of consumption in cities, but then you spread them out on a landscape more evenly, probably the regional and the global impact would be greater. The local impact might be less. So there's these kinds of trade-offs or differences, if you will. And certainly, we need to address the governance issue, which would address some of these other things that you're talking about.
And I'll just kind of riff off that in two comments. One example of what you just talked about is sort of an interesting trend in the U.S. that in the U.S. and almost all Western European economies, urban dwellers tend to use less energy per capita, and there's a whole set of other environmental issues where per capita urban dwellers are more efficient. That does not hold in the developing world because there's a profound change in income as well. So everything else is not equal. And you can do the thought experiment of spreading people around, but in practice it doesn't happen. The other interesting thing, I think if you look at the history of development policies by different nations, there have been attempts to influence the rate of urbanization and the rate at which people move to cities. And I would argue they've been of limited success. You can create push and pull incentives that change the flow a little bit, but there are certain economic processes that are powerful enough that it's hard for governments to do much. And I think urbanization is probably in that category. So I certainly wouldn't, if I was sitting down with a government, a national government, say to them, oh, you should try to slow down the rate of urbanization. I think the attempts to do that in development policy have generally failed in the long term. Does anyone who hasn't asked something want to say something? Yeah. I'm happy to take it, but seriously. Okay.
Okay, I just want to add a comment on Dr. I don't know your name though. Anyway, I think that every phenomena has a kind of, a formative effect, aspect and negative aspect, like a Janus in Roman mythology, or like a yin and yang. In this approach, I think that surely urbanization has a lot of problems, but also it has a lot of key to address those kind of problems. I mean, in cities, women can get better education, and women can get more approaches to their medical care, especially related to their reproductive issues, and the more education and when it comes to the wealth issues, I don't think that it is. I think that it's really difficult to assess the value of wealth itself. I mean, as you told before, excessive use of wealth can cause obesity, something like that. But when we see the donation culture, something like that, it gives a lot of chance to the poor people for better living. So I think that urbanization has a lot of negative effect, but it can be addressed only inside of the urban cities. That is my comment.
I have a question. It's a little bit afield from what I've heard the dialogue here, and I apologize for coming in so late. Is anybody here aware of anyone who is thinking about the climate change impact upon the holding capacity of populations in rural areas and agricultural areas, and what that is going to have to do, maybe not in my lifetime, but certainly in my daughter's lifetime, upon the urban-rural continuum? I'm thinking of things like, the potential desertification of huge areas of very, 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 very productive land, okay, and how that's just going to have to drive a drastic decrease in density, okay, and either those people are going to die or they're going to go somewhere.
Well, it's a good question, and I'll take a first stab at this. So there certainly are a lot of ecologists and agronomists trying to think through what does climate change mean for both natural ecosystems, at the shop where I work at, think about that, and then agricultural systems. I would say the view of folks at the FAO now and other places is that globally, even with climate change, you can envision having a similar amount or more amount of food. And the challenge is when there are large shifts in a particular place in production capacity. And so, to be fair in the discussion, some places would increase. Global warming is probably great for Canada, frankly. Right. But there are countries that will really suffer. Right. There are countries that are really going to suffer, and particularly if they don't have enough money to buy food, or if the food trade is disrupted, it's a nightmare scenario. It is. And I believe there are other UN reports that talk about climate change refugees based on this idea. So the difficulty, I guess, with the carrying capacity term you used is how do you define that now? And sort of the spatial scale is going to depend on food trade and income flows and how much money people have to buy food.
These forces are so great. I was talking to the deputy mayor of San Francisco a month and a half ago. And there's an artificial island in the San Francisco Bay next to Yerba Buena Island called Treasure Island, which was originally built for a World's Fair and then was used by the military for years. Okay, well, that's going to become a new community. Okay. They have calculated, the hydrologist around the Bay Area, that they have to raise the base level of that island 3 feet, okay, within the next 15 years, okay, because of the increased water level, all right? And these are people I respect, these engineers, all right? And I asked the deputy mayor, what happens if it goes up 10 feet? He says, we forget about that because the city of San Francisco is gone. All right, now, these kind of forces, it seems to me, are going to have, could have the potential for, I don't even know how to describe the scale problems.
Yeah, I think that's right. At an intermediate level of catastrophe from climate change, at a small level of sea level rise or a small level of climate change, I think what you'll see is that richer countries will get by and poor countries will be screwed, frankly. So the case you talked about in San Francisco is similar. I talked with someone in Lower Manhattan about this, and they were costing out what would it cost to protect Lower Manhattan, and it was in the hundreds of billions. On the other hand, I said to him, well, you're going to build it? He said, well, shoot, the real estate down there is worth about 100 trillion. Yeah, we'll do it.
The engineers are already working on the Thames River.
Right. So, but the challenge would be a country like Bangladesh or some of the small island nations, and they are screwed, even with a small level of sea level rise. In the limit, if climate change gets bad enough, then it gets hard even for rich countries to cope. So there's this whole other issue which you didn't raise, but I think it's important, of how urbanization fits into the CO2 emissions picture. And there was a neat report in the most recent World Energy Outlook by the IEA where there's a whole chapter on cities and what is cities-specific contribution. So if anyone has read that, it's a good lesson. And by helping this migration in the developing countries from people from a rural area to cities is increasing incomes, and that has enormous gains in terms of poverty alleviation, but it does dramatically increase emissions. And that poses this huge, huge challenge to the world at the time we're trying to reduce total CO2 emissions.
Well, I guess the one thing I would add is there have been some estimates, you probably know this already, but there have been some estimates of those people that would be impacted by a sea level rise of, 10 meters around the world, and I think the numbers are much greater than originally suggested. I think those within cities we're talking about 350 million, something like 365 million people would be affected, basically lose their homes, and of course it would depend upon not only rich versus poor, but also sort of the geomorphology. Bangladesh is very flat, so there's going to be massive flooding as opposed to places like Japan where you have steep terrain immediately once you move off the coast. So it's certainly an issue, and we Robert and I looked at those numbers and we said, you know what, they probably will be even higher if you include some of the things that you were getting at, which would be changes in the hydrologic cycle that would affect water supplies. Right, so it's just not it's not the sea level rise itself, but it's just the availability of water, which would shift, and we're very interested in looking at that.
Aquatic life in the oceans as the oceans warm.
And or that issue too. I mean,
I think what he's referring is not just the ocean side of it, but the kinds of issues you're seeing in California already, where essentially the drinking water supply is at levels much below what they planned for. And I think that is a pattern that you could potentially see a lot more of as climate warmed. Yeah.
Did they talk about the river level also would be 11?
Yeah, I haven't seen too much research on that, but you're right that in general, if the sea level rises, many of the coastal cities will also flood along their rivers. There was a neat mapping. Yeah, there was a neat mapping of what would be flooded in Boston under sea level rise, and a lot of it is essentially flooding from the Charles River. So it's that kind of phenomenon. other questions or comments?
I just have one comment. In all of these discussions on urban, what I'm always amazed at is that there's no discussion of population. It strikes me that that really is the key to a lot of this, that we have too many people, and distributing them in any way that makes sense is going to be problematic given diminishing resources and externalities like sea level rise. And I guess I'm wondering, in all the discussions, is a lot being done in the population area to look at levels of population? I mean, I know in urban areas fertility levels go down and population tends to go down. However, in smaller cities, that sort of fertility change isn't happening quite as quickly, so you're still having a lot of people. And I'm wondering how one deals with that and how one... You probably don't know, but I've always been struck in these conversations that no one mentions population.
Do you want to say, certainly the demographers have thought a lot about this fertility and urbanization question, and you probably know that better than I do.
Well, I mean, not only is it there's differences between cities, but there's differences within cities, for example. And I think one of our colleagues mentioned sort of the poor slum areas. We find fertility rates are lower than rural areas, but not as low as sort of other areas within the city. But and you probably know this too, what the UN has been talking about in terms of its predictions is that we're going to top out at somewhere between 8.5 and let's say 9.5 billion on the planet. And that'll be sometime in, between 2030 and 2050 or 2060. That's the prediction. That's how many people, whether we have the carrying capacity, well, obviously it will depend upon the carrying capacity, but that's all things business as usual with medium-level fertility rate changes. That's what we can expect. If we wanted to reduce that, one of the arguments is get people into cities. Because, as mentioned, people in cities have lower fertility rates. The other one would be, among several others, another one would be educate women, et cetera, et cetera. But it certainly is an issue, and certainly something that, as Robert mentioned, demographers would be speaking very directly to.
And I think I would just add to that. I think it's true that environmentalists, whether we're talking about urban issues or other issues, often now skirt the population discussion because it's very sensitive. And it can quickly turn into political sort of blaming on one side or the other. From my perspective, it's interesting to talk about the UN projection of where we'll top out and what the world could conceivably do to pull us down a little bit. But regardless, even if somehow the world went totally for free birth control and education for women and everything, there's a very large gain of population. And so that's coming. And the challenge for conservationists as environmentalists is to think through, well, how do we make sure we have the most green and safe and healthy world, given that that's coming?
Because there's such big trends. I mean, we will start to see supposedly rural populations are still increasing. It's just that urban populations are increasing faster. We won't see the rural populations generally, globally, start to decrease until about 2020 or 2025. Then they'll start to come down. And then after that, we'll start to see slowly, as Robert mentioned, there's an inertia. And that's going to carry through. But once those rural populations start coming down, then we expect to see total population start to top out. It's like a big S curve, arguably. Well, that's predicted, and Robert I completely agree with his point. Is that it's a sensitive issue. You don't want to start pointing fingers at this or that, because it can break down easily into that. I think potentially a more constructive way to address this is to say, okay, with this number, what are we going to do?
Right.
Or how are we going to get there?
And the other side that's always worth talking about when you talk about population is, affluence levels, how much people are consuming, and the technology they're using to do that consumption. And arguably, I would argue both of those are probably more important than population growth right now. Most of the big rise in CO2 emissions is not strictly a population issue, it's a rise in consumption and income issue.
Actually, if we look the history of urbanization, historic perspective is this. The reason we have an urbanization is we try to deal with population growth, to better manage the population growth.
Yeah, I think certainly that's one of the theories that people have talked about. Yeah. So how long does this go? We're past time. Okay, well, shall we just call it a day? And thank you all for coming.
Okay, thanks a lot.